I have a colleague who used to serve a congregation which still to this day puts on a kind of annual living nativity pageant just before Christmas. Now, the church sits at the center of its town and has an expansive front lawn. And on that certain December Sunday afternoon every year, it fills that lawn with live sheep and goats and donkeys, costumed shepherds and wise men, a gaggle of angels, an innkeeper, a manger, and of course, the Holy Family. Ample crowds gather every year to see this Christmas story acted out live and in person. One year, the men playing the role of the Magi thought it'd be a good idea to borrow a thurible, an incense-burning censer from the local Catholic parish in town. The idea was that as they trekked across the lawn toward the manger, these mysterious magi from the east would surround themselves with a fog of incense to add to the exotic quality of their appearing. So the wise men gathered in the fellowship hall waiting for their cue. Then, just before the moment arrived, they lit the incense and got it burning properly. Unbeknownst to them, however, they managed to trigger the church's fire alarm, which sent an automatic signal to the local fire department. As they walked toward the manger, each bearing a gift for the newborn Christ child, they were astonished to see yellow-slickered firemen unrolling fire hoses across the church lawn and mingling in a scene of confusion with the shepherds, angels, and goats. Ultimately, the fire chief spotted the burning incense pot and put two to two together, announced in a loud voice heard by all, "You stupid wise men! You're setting off alarms all over town." Well, I don't know for sure, but I imagine somewhere in the great beyond, the original Magi smiling down in approval at such a scene. After all, their story sets off all kinds of alarms too, doesn't it? While Isaiah announces that all the nations will stream to the Lord's mountain, no one imagined they would arrive with horoscopes and fragrant aromatics and nature religion. As Tom Long says, these are not Jews from Jerusalem going to find out if the prophecy is fulfilled, or even the sort of next-door Gentiles who might have slipped over the border to help out with the wheat harvest. No, these are Magi, astrologers, magicians from the east carrying gold and perfumes and tracking their journey by the stars. These are Gentiles from afar, those the early Israelites would have pointed to as unclean and unchosen, likely dressed in cultural garb and speaking a language with an accent that would have made them stick out like a sore thumb. There's no perfect analogy for this today, but think of it this way. Imagine the most unlikely of characters, the homeless man with whiskey still fresh on his breath, for example, the alleged felon out on bond awaiting trial, the illegal immigrant, all waltzing in to meet the most ruthless dictator of the time to ask where the new king has been born. Setting off alarms may be an understated description of what these Magi are really doing. I suppose that's at least in part the reason that Matthew goes so far as to refer to their arrival in Jerusalem as disturbing. He describes not just Herod, but all of Jerusalem as frightened by the Magi, their reference to this star and its connection to the birth of the King of the Jews. Which got me wondering if it's not just whispers of a new king that causes this fear, but more specifically the rising of the Bethlehem star itself. After all, if it was as ominous as our tradition makes it out to be, and even some astrologers suggest is possible, I can understand the reason for which all of Jerusalem would have likely been afraid. While astrology has never really been an interest of mine, somewhere along the way I remember reading about how the stars throughout history have been a way for people to interpret what's happening in the world. The ancient historian Josephus noted that a star stood over the city of Jerusalem just before its fall in 70 AD. There are many who thought the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD had been caused by a comet. Likewise, the appearance of a star in the sky over England in 1066, just before the Battle of Hastings, was seen as a dark omen of what was to come. Even in more modern history, there were some who blamed a star for the fall of the Alamo. I saw a piece on PBS a few years ago during which they explored several theories of what the Bethlehem star could have actually been. One was that it was Halley's Comet, which was supposed to have been in the sky at roughly the same time. Another was that it was a supernova that exploded just about that same time period. Some even think it could have been a convergence of Jupiter and Saturn together to make one gigantic bright spot in the sky. And yet I don't think the star in this story is as much about astrology as it is theology. And if you've ever really paid attention to this star in pictures on Christmas cards or even in art, like that printed on the front of your bulletin today, you know what I'm talking about. Almost without exception, the star is shown in the form of a cross, a foreshadowing, of course, of the deeply disturbing events of Jesus' life, which, if we're honest, is the reason this story doesn't just frighten Herod and Jerusalem. The truth of it frightens me and you too. After all, if Jesus truly came to this earth for all people, to reconcile everyone and everything to himself, if even Gentiles, out-of-place migrant strangers from afar, the least expected among us, can come and worship this King and have access to the gift of God's love in Jesus Christ, well, that's a disturbing thought. Because like Herod, we then lose our power too. And you know what I mean. Our power to regulate who's chosen and who's not, who's in and who's out, who's a sinner and who's a saint, who's worthy and who's worthless, who's lost and who is found. There's an unexpected, amusing moment in Raymond Brown's commentary on the New Testament Christmas text entitled The Birth of the Messiah. Brown observes how the piety or the tradition of the church has worked overtime on the story of the Epiphany. In the Christian imagination, the Magi have morphed into kings, and we've decided there are 3 of them, neither of which is found in the biblical text. In reenactments and retellings, we've given them different skin colors and ethnicities and names. Brown even cites an entry in an ancient saint's calendar in which the 3 wise men have served as tireless champions of the gospel, meet for one last Christmas reunion in Armenia, and after celebrating the Mass of the Nativity, the 3 Magi die within days of one another. Of course, not one of these details is included in the story we have today. One would expect Brown, the serious biblical scholar, to criticize such embellishments. Instead, though, he makes observation that of all this coloring of the story with the crayons of our imagination is perhaps exactly what Matthew is after. What if Brown suggests that the exotic details are there to invite us to imagine the unimaginable? That the God of Israel has in generosity turned the face of mercy and grace toward not just the descendants of Abraham, but in Jesus Christ to all nations and all people throughout history. That even Gentiles from the other side of the world and neighbors from the other side of the street and folks from the other side of the railroad tracks can all imagine themselves in this story. In other words, in every time and in every place, the story of the Magi communicates that all people can come to the manger, bow before the newborn King, and give and receive God's love and grace. That means Americans and Iranians, black and white, rich and poor, gay and straight. That means Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell and Charles Schumer, Kim Jong-un and Bashar al-Assad, Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King Jr. Whether you think you've done the unforgivable, live as a perfect saint, believe but do not practice your faith, or find yourself somewhere in between, God has sent God's love in the form of the Christ child to be with you. Which makes it no wonder Herod wants Jesus dead. And no wonder humanity will nail him to a cross. The real gift of this season is not gold, frankincense, or myrrh, or an iPad, or a bicycle, or cash in an envelope. No, the real gift, quite frankly, is a scandal. One that, if we're honest deep down, none of us really want. And if you don't believe me, just bring it up at your next dinner party. Or maybe it came up over the holidays this year with family and friends. Simply tell people God's love is for everyone equally the same, no matter what, that all people are welcome in God's kingdom without caveat, condition, or explanation. It's not just Herod in Jerusalem. We're all frightened by this kind of love. Or at least my previous congregation certainly was. They had an annual living nativity tradition of their own, although not quite as sophisticated as the one I described in the beginning of this sermon. It began when the church building was located downtown and a great deal of traffic drove by to experience the scene. Today, though, the church is tucked back in a neighborhood with very little traffic, and a small group from the church is always there to keep watch on that night. It's changed in other ways, too, over the years. At one time, the character roles were played strictly by middle school and high school-aged youth. However, throughout the years, depending upon the size of the youth group, there were times the church had to supplement with adults and younger children too. Sometimes even embellishing the story, putting folks of different gender and age in roles that perhaps the tradition would not necessarily smile upon. At times even going without a character that Christianity is commonly placed at the scene. But perhaps the biggest change is that at one time that church was the only church in town that had a living nativity. And now just about every church in that town has one. It's a sore point for the congregation, even today. They miss having a monopoly on the nativity. The competition frightens them. And isn't that Matthew's point? That gathering with one another at the manger is not a contest, but a gift that everyone can give and receive. No matter who you are, where you're from, what you think you've done to deserve or be denied it, you're given the grace to color yourself into this story, which of course happens in one of two ways. We can become like Herod, angry, outraged, even violent against those whom we decide should be excluded. Or we could do as the Magi did after experiencing the gift of the Christ child. Matthew writes, they left for their country by another road.